The check landed face down on the cherrywood table, and my father-in-law pressed his palm against it like he was sealing a deal at one of his golf club lunches. He didn't slide it. He pressed. There's a difference, and I noticed it because that little detail told me he'd been practicing this moment in his head for weeks, maybe months. Take it, he said. His voice had that polished gravel rich men use when they think they're being merciful. Cash it on Monday. Be gone by Friday. We all move on. My wife sat to his left with her hands folded in her lap like a Sunday school photograph. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the small votive candle in the middle of the table, watching it flicker, like the flame was the most fascinating thing in the room. Her mother sat across from her, slicing a piece of roasted duck into pieces too small to eat, like she was performing patience for an invisible audience. I picked up the check. I let myself look at the number for exactly 2 seconds before I set it back down without flipping it over. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching my face change. "What's this for?" I asked. My father-in-law smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's already won. "For your trouble. For the years. For making this easy." My wife finally spoke, and her voice was so light it almost wasn't there. "Don't make a scene, please. Please." That word did something to my chest I wasn't ready for. 3 years of marriage, and the only thing she could say to me at that table was, "Please don't make a scene." Not, "I'm sorry," not, "I love you," but not even my name. Just a request that I disappear quietly so her family's dinner wouldn't be ruined. I looked at the three of them, my father-in-law, leaning back now, fingers laced over his stomach. My mother-in-law, still cutting that duck into nothing. My wife, candle watching. And under the table, in my jacket pocket, my phone buzzed once. I knew without looking who it was. I knew because I'd been waiting on that exact message for 9 days. The board had made its decision, and not one person at that table had any idea what that meant. My name is Tobias Renn. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 3 years, I've been married to a woman named Margot who believed, with her whole chest, that she had married down. She wasn't wrong about a lot of things. She was wrong about that one. I met Margot at a dive bar in Portland 9 years ago, back before either of us had figured out who we were going to become. She was a paralegal then, working 60-hour weeks for a firm that paid her like she was decorative furniture. I was running a small operations consultancy out of a one-bedroom apartment, taking jobs that nobody wanted and quietly rebuilding broken supply chains for companies too embarrassed to admit they were broken in the first place. We were both tired. We were both ambitious. We made sense for a long time. I'm going to tell you something I never told anyone, not even my best friend. The first time Margot told me she loved me, she said it on the porch of a rented cabin outside Bend, and she said it because I had spent the entire weekend listening to her describe what kind of life she wanted. Big house, dinner parties, a husband who knew what fork to use, a husband other women looked at twice. She said all of that, and then she said, "I love you." And I remember thinking she was loving an idea of me that didn't exist yet but might. I told her I'd build whatever she wanted. I just didn't tell her how. The thing about building real money is that it happens quietly if you're patient. I bought a stake in a freight automation company in 2019 when nobody understood what it did. I put almost everything I had into restructuring a regional grocery distribution network in 2020 when everyone else was panicking about shutdowns. By the time Margot and I got married in 2022, I owned controlling interests in 3 businesses and was the silent majority partner in a 4th. A healthcare staffing platform called Brightline Solutions that was about to become very, very important to a lot of hospitals in the Pacific Northwest. Margot didn't know. She didn't know because I didn't tell her, and I didn't tell her because by then I'd already figured out what kind of woman she was becoming. The kind who needed her husband's status to be visible. The kind who would have spent the money instead of letting it grow. The kind who would have started introducing me at parties as my husband who owns instead of my husband, Tobias. I drove a 2017 Subaru. I lived in the same modest 2-bedroom Craftsman in a neighborhood she always wanted to leave. I wore the same 3 button-downs to her family events, and every single year, her family treated me a little worse for it. Her father, Philip, ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in Seattle. He'd inherited most of it from his own father and spent 40 years convinced he was a self-made man. He never asked me a question about my work without already having a punchline prepared. "Still doing your little consulting thing, Tobias?" was a favorite. Another one, "Maybe one day you'll get your name on a building." He'd say it at Christmas dinner, at Easter brunch, at the country club where I was technically a guest but always seated near the kitchen. Margot laughed at every single joke. That was the part that started killing me. Not Philip. Philip was just a man performing the role he'd been cast in 50 years ago. It was Margot's laughter. Light, polite, embarrassed laughter. Like she was apologizing to her family for me. Like she was telling them, with every chuckle, I know, I picked wrong, but I'm working on it." About 18 months ago, Brightline Solutions started its push to acquire a competing staffing platform called Halverson Medical Group. Halverson was bigger but bleeding cash, and their CEO was looking for an exit. The deal took most of last year to put together, and I did all of it from coffee shops and my home office, never once mentioning it to my wife. By the time the deal closed in March, Brightline had effectively absorbed Halverson and become the largest healthcare staffing operation in the region. 2,200 employees, hospital contracts in 5 states, a board of 7, of which I controlled 4 seats directly and a 5th through a trust. The week the deal closed, Margot got promoted. She'd been at Halverson for 2 years, working her way up through their corporate development office. She came home that night with a bottle of champagne and the brightest smile I'd seen on her face in months. "VP of Strategic Partnerships," she said, holding the bottle up like a trophy. "6-figure raise, equity package. They're talking about putting me on the leadership track." I poured the champagne. I toasted her. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. Because some small part of me thought maybe this would be enough. Maybe getting what she wanted from her own career would loosen the grip her family had on how she saw me. 2 weeks later, she came home and told me Philip wanted us over for dinner. Just family. Something to talk about. She wouldn't look at me when she said it. I should have known then. I think I did know. Somewhere under the part of me that was still hoping. The 7 days leading up to that dinner were the longest of my marriage. Margot started leaving the room to take phone calls. She'd come back in with her face arranged carefully, like she'd practiced her expression in the bathroom mirror. She started asking me things she already knew the answer to. "How's work going, sweetheart? Are you still doing the consulting? Have you thought about maybe looking at something more stable?" She said the word stable like it tasted bad. On the 5th night, I found the folder on the kitchen island. She'd been working late and forgotten to take it upstairs. I shouldn't have opened it. I opened it. Inside was a printout of our prenup, marked up in her handwriting. Margins, separations, asset divisions, notes in red pen. One note said, "Has no claim on Halverson equity per section 4.2. Another said, "Confirm with Dad's attorney by Thursday." A third just said, in a smaller, almost embarrassed hand, "Be kind about it. Be kind about it." I closed the folder. I put it back exactly where it was. I went upstairs and I lay in bed next to my wife, who was already asleep, and I listened to her breathe for 2 hours straight without moving a muscle. I wasn't planning anything yet. I was just memorizing what her breathing sounded like, because I knew that within the week I would never sleep next to her again. The next morning I called my chief of staff at Brightline and told her I needed the board's recommendation on the open CFO position by the following Friday. She asked me if there was something going on. I told her there was, and that I'd explain when I could. But for now, I just needed the timeline moved up. She said okay. That's the thing about good people. They don't ask twice. The dinner was on a Friday. I drove us in the Subaru. Margot was quiet the whole way over, fiddling with the strap of her purse, checking her phone, not looking at me. When we pulled into her parents' circular driveway in Medina, she said, "Tobias, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know it isn't personal." I almost laughed. I didn't. I just said, "Okay." Her mother, Joanna, met us at the door with a glass of wine already in her hand. She air-kissed me without making contact with my skin. Philip was in the dining room, standing at the head of the table, hands in his pockets, surveying his kingdom. The dining room had been redecorated since the last time I'd been there. New chandelier, new chairs. The kind of dining room you have when you want the room itself to do the intimidating for you. "Tobias," he said. He didn't shake my hand. He just nodded toward my seat. We sat down. Joanna brought out the duck. Philip uncorked a bottle of wine that he made sure to mention it cost $300. We made small talk for about 15 minutes. The weather. A boat he was thinking of buying. Margot's new role at Halverson, which Philip described as a real step up, finally. Margot laughed her embarrassed laugh. Then Philip set down his fork and pulled the envelope out of his jacket pocket and slid the check across the cherry wood. Pressed it down with his palm. Held it there. Take it, he said. Cash it on Monday. Be gone by Friday. We all move on. I let the silence sit for a beat. I picked up my wine glass, took a small sip, set it down. I looked at Margot. She was still watching the candle. Honey, I said. My voice was very calm. I needed it to be calm. Did you know about this? She didn't answer. Margot. She finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but they were also resolved. Those are two very different kinds of wet. Tobias, she said. I've been thinking about this for a long time. We want different things. You're a good man, but I'm going somewhere, and I'm going to need to be unencumbered. Unencumbered. The same word she'd used in the folder. She must have practiced it. Philip jumped in before I could respond. Look, son, let's be men about this. My daughter's career is taking off. She's been told she's on track for the C-suite at Halverson within 5 years. You and I both know you're not the kind of husband that fits that picture. You're not a bad guy. You're just not built for it. Take the check. Find someone simpler. Everyone wins. Someone simpler. Joanna chimed in then. She put her hand on top of Margot's hand. The gesture you make for a child who's been brave at the dentist. We just want what's best for everyone. We've thought about this very carefully. Philip even had Davis draw up an addendum to the prenup that's very generous, Tobias. More generous than the original. $312,000. That's what was on the check. I'd seen it when I first picked it up. $312,000 to disappear from the life of a woman I had loved for 9 years. I sat there and I felt something in me get very, very still. Not angry. Not even sad anymore. Just still. The way the ocean gets still right before a big wave pulls back from the beach. I looked at Philip. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you know what Brightline Solutions is? He blinked. The question came from the wrong direction, and he wasn't ready for it. Brightline. Yeah, sure, that's the parent company over at Halverson. The acquisition. Margot's mentioned them. Right. I nodded slowly. And do you know who owns Brightline? He frowned. I mean, it's a private holding. I don't know specifically. Why? I took my phone out of my jacket pocket and unlocked it. The message was still there. From my chief of staff, exactly 9 words long. Board approved restructure. CFO confirmed. Awaiting your final sign-off. I set the phone face down on the cherry wood, next to the check, and I looked at my wife. Margot, I said, who signed your paychecks? She frowned. What? Who signs your paychecks? The company. Who issues them? I don't. It's Brightline. They route through Brightline now since the acquisition. Why are you asking me this? Because, I said, the man whose signature is on the bottom of those checks is sitting at this table. Nobody moved. Philip was the first to recover. Because Philip was a man who'd spent his whole life refusing to be wrong. He let out a short laugh. What are you talking about, Tobias? I own Brightline, I said. I've owned the controlling stake since 2020. I structured the Halverson acquisition. I sit on the board. My name isn't on any of the public filings because I prefer it that way. But if you call Davis tomorrow morning and have him pull the cap table, he'll find it. I'd actually recommend that. It'll save us all some time. Margot's hand went to her mouth. Margot, I continued. The promotion you got 2 weeks ago. The VP role. The equity package. The leadership track. All of that came from a restructuring plan that I personally approved. Because I didn't want my wife's career to be collateral damage when the merger went through. I asked the board to expedite your promotion as a personal favor to me. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel weird about it. I wanted you to think you'd earned it. You did earn it, actually. But I made sure the door opened. She was crying now. Quietly but openly. The candle kept flickering. Philip stood up. His face had gone the color of cold meat. This is a bluff. This is some kind of, you can't just sit there and claim. I'm not claiming anything, Philip. I'm telling you, you can verify it on Monday. I'd recommend you do, before you say another word. Joanna had set down her wine glass. Her hand was shaking just enough that the stem clicked against the wood. I picked up the check. I looked at it one more time. $312,000. I tore it in half, then I tore the halves in half. Then I set the pieces down in a neat little pile next to the candle. I want to be very clear about what's happening right now, I said. Margot, I'm going to file for divorce on Monday morning. My attorney will be in touch with yours. The prenup will be honored exactly as written. You won't get $1 more than what we signed for, and you won't get $1 less, because I'm not the kind of man who punishes people through the legal system. I leave that to your father. Tobias, she started. I'm not finished. I kept my voice level. I had been practicing for this moment too, I realized, even if I hadn't known it. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to call the chairman of the Bright Line board and inform him that effective immediately, I'm initiating a leadership review of the Halverson integration. There have been some concerns raised about how the acquisition has been managed at the executive level. Specifically, there's a question of whether certain VP-level promotions were appropriate given the timing and the personal relationships involved. Margot's face went white. I'm going to recuse myself from the review, of course, because of the obvious conflict. But I expect the board will move quickly. They tend to. You wouldn't, she whispered. I wouldn't have, I said. Last week, I wouldn't have. But your father just offered me $312,000 to disappear from your life. And you let him. You sat at this table and you let your father put a price on me, and you watched. And you said, please, don't make a scene. So now I'm making a scene, quietly, like I do everything. Philip slammed his palm down on the table. The candle jumped. You son of a... Sit down, Philip. He didn't sit down. But he didn't say anything else either. He just stood there, breathing hard, finally seeing me. It was almost worth the whole 9 years just for that look. Almost. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I looked at my wife one last time. The woman I had loved for almost a decade. The woman I would not love again. For what it's worth, I said, I would have given you everything. I was going to tell you about Brightline this year. I had a whole plan. I was going to surprise you with a trip to Italy and tell you over dinner in Florence. I wanted you to know that the life you'd always wanted was the life I'd been building for you the entire time. You just had to be patient. You just had to believe me when I told you I was working on it. She was shaking her head. Tobias, please, just let me explain. There's nothing to explain. You made your choice tonight. Or honestly, you made it about 3 months ago, when you started leaving the room to take phone calls. I just didn't know what you were choosing, until now. I walked out of that dining room. I walked past the new chandelier and the new chairs and the staged photographs on the staged walls. I drove home in the Subaru, and I felt nothing the whole drive, which surprised me. I'd expected to feel something. Anger, grief, vindication. Something. But there was just the road and the engine and the quiet. Monday morning, I filed for divorce. By Wednesday, the Brightline board had voted unanimously to launch a formal review of the Halverson integration. By Friday, Margot was on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. By the following Monday, 2 executives at Halverson who had been involved in fast-tracking her promotion were also placed on leave. None of it had my fingerprints on it. None of it needed to. The truth was already there, sitting in expense reports and email threads, waiting for someone to actually look. Margot called me 11 times that first week. I didn't answer. On the 12th call, she left a voicemail, and against my better judgment, I listened to it. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't understood. She said she'd never seen me clearly, and she wanted a chance to start over. I deleted it. Philip's commercial real estate firm had a financing relationship with one of the regional banks where I sit on the advisory board. I never said a word to anyone there. I didn't need to. Philip's reputation, once whispered about, did the work for me. Within 4 months, 2 of his biggest clients had quietly moved their business elsewhere. His firm didn't collapse. People like Philip don't collapse, but they shrink. And I imagine he sat in his shrinking office and tried to figure out exactly where he'd gone wrong. And I imagine he never figured it out, because men like Philip never do. Margot resigned from Halverson 3 months after the review opened. The official statement called it a personal decision. She moved out of the state. I heard, through a mutual friend, that she'd taken a job at a smaller firm in Denver, a real step down from the leadership track she'd been promised. The friend told me Margot had asked about me. I told the friend to please not relay messages in either direction. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in October. I signed the papers in my attorney's office. I went home. I sat on the porch of the modest craftsman in the neighborhood Margot had always wanted to leave, and I watched the sun go down, and I let myself feel everything I hadn't let myself feel that night at the dinner table. It took about an hour. It was the longest hour of my life. And then it passed. A friend asked me, a few months later, if I regretted any of it. If I wished I had handled it differently. Given her another chance, maybe. Tried harder to make her understand. I thought about it for a long time. No, I told him. She got exactly what she wanted. She just didn't understand what she was wanting from. He nodded. He didn't push. The thing nobody tells you about being underestimated for a long time is that it changes you in a way that's hard to reverse. You spend so many years being patient, being quiet, letting people decide who you are without bothering to correct them, that when you finally do correct them, you don't feel triumphant. You just feel tired. Tired and a little sad that they couldn't see you when seeing you would have been easy. Tired and a little sad that the people who claimed to love you the most were the ones who looked the least. I bought a new car last spring. Nothing flashy. Just newer. The Subaru had finally given up on me, and I figured I'd earned the upgrade. The salesman asked me what I did for a living. I told him I was in operations. He said that sounded boring. I told him it usually was. We both laughed. I drove home in the new car, and I parked it in the driveway of the same modest craftsman. And I went inside and made myself dinner. And I ate it alone, and for the first time in 9 years, eating dinner alone didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a choice I had made on my own, in a life I had built on my own, in a house that was mine, in a quiet I had earned. I think about that dinner sometimes. The duck, the candle, the cherry wood, the way Philip pressed his palm against the check like he was sealing my fate, when really he was sealing his own. I think about Margot watching the candle so she wouldn't have to watch me. I think about all the small moments that led up to that night, all the laughter at all the jokes, all the times I said nothing when I should have said something, and then I stopped thinking about it. Because there's a meeting at 9 and my coffee is getting cold and life, as it turns out, is very long when you stop spending it trying to be loved by people who were never going to look up and see you. I've sat with that night 100 times since, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't the check or the duck, or even Margot's face watching the candle. It's the quiet truth that none of what happened was an accident. Philip didn't wake up one morning and decide to humiliate me. He'd been practicing that humiliation in small doses for years. At every holiday, every country club lunch, every Christmas where he seated me near the kitchen. And Margot didn't suddenly betray me at 34. She'd been rehearsing that betrayal in tiny scenes. One embarrassed laugh at a time. One phone call she took in the other room. One folder left open on the kitchen island. Every choice we make plants a seed. And every seed eventually grows into the harvest we have to eat. What I learned, sitting in that dining room with $312,000 torn up dollars on the table, is that character isn't something you turn on when it matters. It's something you build in private, in all the moments nobody is watching. I'd spent 9 years quietly building something real because my father raised me to believe that a man who has to announce himself usually hasn't done the work. Philip had spent 40 years announcing himself because he hadn't. The dinner just made that visible. If there's anything I'd want a younger man to take from my story, it's this. Be patient. Be patient in a way that feels almost stupid sometimes. Build the kind of life that doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. Don't argue with people who've already decided who you are. Just keep working, keep saving, keep showing up, and let time do the heavy lifting. The world has a long memory for people who quietly become who they said they'd become, and an even longer memory for people who tried to keep them small. And develop your mind. Not just for money, for perspective. Read enough that when somebody underestimates you, you can see the whole shape of it instead of just feeling the sting. Margot underestimated me because she'd never bothered to ask what I actually did all day. Philip underestimated me because he'd never met a man who didn't perform his worth. Neither of them was evil. They were just unobserved, and unobserved people make catastrophic mistakes. The hardest part wasn't the divorce. It was forgiving the version of me that stayed quiet for so long. The version that laughed off Philip's jokes for the sake of Sunday dinner. The version that drove home from those dinners and told himself it didn't matter, when it mattered every single time. I had to learn that loving someone doesn't mean letting them mistake your softness for weakness. Real strength isn't loud, but it isn't silent forever either. Eventually, it has to draw a line, and when it does, it doesn't apologize. I'm okay now. I sleep well. The new car runs fine. The Craftsman is still mine. And every morning I wake up in a life I built myself with my own two hands in my own quiet way, and that's the only inheritance worth a damn.